Good morning. Is it going to come and tell us you're being recorded? Uh,
Should have already got that. You're good to go. So
we
whenever
are
you're
good
ready
to
to
go.
start.
Good morning, Washington. We are your Unit 1 judges. I think we saw you guys yesterday, at least some of us did. So we'll introduce ourselves again, and we'll ask you to introduce yourselves again. But I am still Tanya McConnell. I was a professor of history at Columbia College in South Carolina. I am now teaching high school and having a great time doing that. And I'm trying to think if my dog stops by, I'll introduce him as well. I'll ask my colleagues if they'll introduce themselves as well.
Go ahead, Margo.
Hi, I'm Margo Lambert. I'm a professor of history at University of Cincinnati Blue Ash College, as you might recall, and my specialty is early American history.
Good morning, Washington. We're up early. I'm Sue Leeson from the state of Oregon. I'm a senior justice on the Oregon Supreme Court.
And would you introduce yourselves and your teacher, please?
Hello, my name is Olivia Andrews, and my favorite philosopher is Voltaire, mainly due to his opposition during the French Revolution. Hello, my name is Kylie Kortenkamp, and my favorite philosopher is Socrates due to his focus on an educated voter body.
Hello, my name is Aidan Abadillah, and my favorite philosopher is Confucius due to his work with ethics and morals. And on behalf of Washington State, Tahoma High School, and our advisor, Gretchen Wolfing, I thank you for judging us today.
And we are honored to be here with you and looking forward to a great discussion. Tahoma High School, that's awesome. Well, let's get down to business, shall we? We're your Unit 1 judges. We're interested in the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system, and we are asking question 2. The foundation for good government is the rule of law. John Adams once wrote, "Good government is an empire of laws." How, if at all, is the rule of law embedded in our founding documents? What challenges to the rule of law, if any, have we experienced in our history? In what ways, if any, has the rule of law been important to the preservation of a free society? If you're ready, please begin.
It is either the rule of law or the law of the ruler. Claude Alexandre, a modern philosopher.
The rule of law is enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, visible in the body of the Constitution, embedded into the Bill of Rights, but also strengthened by subsequent amendments.
The definition of rule of law varies, but philosophers Aristotle, John Locke, and Lon Fuller agree it is crucial that all persons are subject to the same laws. Aristotle's Politics states, if it is advantageous to place a supreme power in some particular persons, they should be appointed to be only guardians and the servants of the laws. The Declaration of Independence reflects these ideas by establishing that the government is instituted amongst men and derives its just powers from the consent of the governed.
The body of the Constitution also demonstrates rule of law through the Supremacy Clause at Article 6, Clause 2.
Federal laws and the Constitution are certified as the supreme law of the land, thereby ensuring that states follow the same constitutional mandates. This is crucial to John Adams' ideas from Thoughts on Government. Good government is an empire of laws and not of men. Additionally, Anti-Federalists fought to include the Bill of Rights to not only prevent a tyrannical government, but to protect individual liberties. However, further amendments, such as the 14th, were needed in order to assert equality under the law.
The rule of law was established in the founding documents, but supplemented by later amendments.
We, the people, have experienced societal and systemic challenges to the rule of law throughout history, some of which are discrimination and legal immunities. A conceptual breach to the rule of law is the dichotomy among differing groups of people. Historically, marginalized groups of people, such as Native Americans, African Americans, and women, have fought for and continue to fight for equal protection under the laws. Some protection is allocated in the 14th, 15th, and 19th Amendments. Additionally, a government can defend against tyranny while breaching the rule of law. It may be necessary to omit certain aspects of the rule of law to better society. For example, legal immunities of government officials are breaches of the rule of law, but necessary for a republic democracy.
The executive branch can evade laws through powers such as executive privilege. Originally used by former President Washington, executive privilege allows the executive branch to withhold information for the common good. Similarly, in Harlow v. Fitzgerald, it established that qualified immunity protects all government officials' actions under the scope of their work, so long as they don't violate clearly established rights.
In each of these instances of discrimination and immunity, the concepts of equality and consistency under the rule of law are violated. The rule of law is detrimental to absolute freedom, but critical for freedom under the law. Freedom is an arbitrary concept due to it changing from person to person.
In The Freedom in the Law, Bruno Leoni, an Italian lawyer philosopher, theorized that it is impossible to have a free society with a government and legislative body that regulates behavior. In The Social Contract, Rousseau agrees and argues that people are unable to be truly free when they are governed. This is because they sacrifice some of their individual rights in exchange for the common good.
For instance, a person is free to exercise their First Amendment rights to assembly and religion as evidenced in Snyder v. Phelps. However, citizens do not have the absolute freedom to do anything. Their restrictions on freedom, such as the time, place, and manner restrictions, apply to the First Amendment in Cox v. New Hampshire. This discrepancy explores the relationship between natural rights philosophy, theorized by John Locke, and classical republicanism, theorized by Thomas Aquinas and Cicero.
The rule of law prevents absolute freedom, but ensures the maximum amount of freedom in a necessarily constricted society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've brought us a lot for us to think about. This raises for me a really big question because we've got our ideals, and our ideals are clearly bound up in the rule of law, and yet they're also bound up in democracy and individual rights, which can sometimes come into conflict. Is there a fundamental conflict between the rule of law and democracy?
I would argue no, that there's not a fundamental conflict because they work together as pillars of American constitutionalism. Rule of law, along with democracy, as well as fear.
Yeah, we'll wait a second here. I paused the clock.
With democracy, there are necessary instances where people must have executive immunities or executive privilege in order to rule people in a way that protects all individuals.
Let me, Aiden, you froze up and we lost you for about 10 seconds there. Would you mind going back and restating? We stopped the clock, so it's not going to work against you. Would you restate? I know that's a weird thing to do, but would you restate what you said? Because I don't want to miss that.
Okay. What I was saying is that the rule of law and democracy do not necessarily conflict because they work together with other pillars such as natural rights philosophy and classical republicanism to uphold American constitutionalism. It's through the balance of these systems and theories that help create a successful government.
I would disagree with my colleague and say that rule of law is in direct conflict with a republican democracy, because in order to rule and keep everyone safe in a government, there are executive immunities and executive privileges that people who rule need to have. In Aristotle's Politics, he states that all people must be protected under the same laws, and by this definition, it does not work with a republican democracy because some people need immunities.
Well, going off of that, Kylie, I want to ask then, when, if ever, can the president be above the law?
As set in U.S. v. Nixon, the president can use executive immunity when discussing national security as well as when looking at military documents.
Additionally, through the Take Care Clause in Article 2, Section 3, the president is able to extend his times of powers in times of crises, some of those being war or natural disaster.
I wanted to push a little bit on an observation you made that states must follow the same mandates under the Supremacy Clause. Have you just wiped out American federalism? And I ask that question because I live in a state, and I think you do too, where we have rights and privileges under our state constitutions and laws that differ quite significantly from what's recognized in national law. I'm thinking death with dignity, some of our marijuana laws, a number of our free speech laws under the Oregon Constitution. How do we reconcile American federalism with the concept of the rule of law?
Correct. It is agreed that there are such things as laboratories of democracy as established in New State Ice Company v. Leeson. And as Washington State does have differing laws, such as marijuana. They're pioneers and laboratories of democracy for marijuana and same-sex marriage. And these are instances of necessary breaches of the rule of law. And as I was mentioning, the balance between these differing concepts of trying to explore different ways to better the government as well as upholding rule of law.
No, I understand that, but you said the supremacy clause means that all states must follow the same mandate. And that now you're saying that's not true.
The supremacy clause does, the supremacy clause does establish some precedent to uphold institutionalism, and that, but it does, there is also other provisions in the Constitution and judicial rulings that help find other pathways as well.
In your original presentation, you made an argument for the basis of that the rule of law is based in the words of the Constitution or the founding documents. I wonder, are these not just words? I mean, if you look at it, Russia's constitution is really pretty spiffy. It guarantees all sorts of things. It's got all sorts of guarantees. And as we can suggest, it probably means just about nothing. How can we be sure that these are more than just words, or that they are actually carried out?
Joseph Raz defined rule of law as he used an analogy. And he said that rule of law is a tool. It's like a knife. It can be used for life-saving surgery, but it can also be used to kill. Rule of law is a tool. And so when it's established in the Constitution, it's up to the people and the government to follow that and use that tool for good.
For what purpose? Stay with that if you would, Kylie. A tool is a means to an end. What's the end?
The end is a protection of people's rights. The means to an end is it's a tool for the protection of people's individual liberties and individual rights and protection under the social contract theory established by Rousseau. People give up some of their individual rights for the common good and its protection from of the democracy.
Additionally, going back to the first part of the question, talking about how people can uphold this idea is through civic participation and civic engagement. One of the most crucial aspects of this is civil discourse, understanding quality conversation and being able to understand bias and celebrate differences rather than refusing to speak of them.
Looking at our First Amendment, we have the right to assemble as well as protest. This is also how we can check the government and ensure that they are doing what we believe is what footing for equality. This is prevalent in modern day. In a modern day example would be the Black Lives Matter movement, and however, in a historical example would be the Civil Rights movement. In addition, a way to make sure that rule of law is used as a tool for good is voting. People can exercise their rights to vote and influence their democracy in a way that is positive towards everyone.
What about, you mentioned the civil rights movement. What about when the civil rights movement turned violent with Malcolm X, for example? How would you reconcile that with what you've been stating here?
To answer this question, I would look towards my favorite philosopher, Voltaire. He was very prevalent during the French Revolution, and he would agree that when your individual liberties are being stepped on and people are being oppressed, that violence may be needed in order to check your government. It states with our social contract theory, as defined by Rousseau, that we have the right to abolish or change the government if it is not instituting what we believe we need.
And what about January 6th?
I would disagree with my colleague and say that in both of these instances, it's important to, rather than violence, have a conversation, going back to that concept of civil discourse. And it's important, and when people are unwilling to listen, it may be necessary to peacefully protest, but violence doesn't open news.
On the topic of January 6th, people were going against, people say that the January 6th insurrection was because of the big lie. And people were going against the government based on something that wasn't factual, and that they were doubting the election process, which is a very important pillar of our democracy. And so this insurrection was violent, and it shouldn't have been.
And now let's take it to the next step. Public opinion polls are showing people don't care about it anymore. It's over. The January 6th committee may as well just close down because people are ready to move on. How is that consistent with the supremacy clause and rule of law?
The concept of moving on from an instance in a conflict is detrimental, and it helps erode the foundations of democracy, because it's through open conversation and understanding differing points of view that we can uphold these crucial concepts such as rule of law. The government only works as long as its integrity is kept intact. Going back to the question previously about what happens if people don't listen, that is a crucial aspect of it.
Let's go. I keep being brought back to January 6th. I know we all want to move beyond it, but there it is. By and large, I think the people who assaulted his Capitol believed that they were protecting, that they were doing the right thing, that they were protecting their democracy. Does that grant them any grace, or are they arguably guilty of treason? How do we deal with things like that? Does the rule of law win, or does their sense of democracy win, however misguided it might have been?
Martin Luther King Jr. said that legislative processes can regulate behavior, but not morals. So although we cannot punish them for a moral aspect of right or wrong, even regardless of what their morals were, if they broke the law, they are still subject under the law, which is the upholding the pillar of rule of law. But it is important when having discussions to understand there are different points of view, but regardless of your views, you still can't break the law if it's not factual.
Go ahead, Olivia.
Furthermore, the main difference is that they started out with violence and they did not start out with a peaceful protest, as we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, or even going further back to the civil rights movement.
Go ahead. I had a question there, then you answered it. Go ahead. Anybody else?
One argument I heard yesterday is that rule of law really is enforced best through fear. You break the law, you're going to be punished. Is that your view of the status of the rule of law in most people's minds in this country, and should it be?
That is not the rule of law. That would be rule by law, which is evident currently in Russia. And as you can see through the current Ukraine and Russia conflict, that they are ruling by law in a more tyrannical government. Historically, we can see this in Nazi Germany. Yes, I would.
That's a good place to end.
Thank you.
So outstanding. We kept trying to trip you up with one thing after the other, and you responded logically, thoughtfully. I think it's important that we say, these really are just words, and it takes the education, it takes the sentiment, the belief, the faith that at least most of us are going to abide by those words. And I think one example of somebody said yesterday, if most of us don't stop at the stoplight, it becomes meaningless. And one of a question I ask in class talking about this is, how long does it take to get from one place to the other? And they say about 15 minutes. But if there were no stop signs, no laws, no right drive on the right, drive on the left, never get there. I mean, I have, it'd be like driving in Italy. You just I think I'm kidding. Actually, worse than Romania was worse. But anyway, but so it's not that because we can never enforce those laws enough, but unless all of us, by and large, agree to go by them. So thank you. Great conversation.
I agree. I thought you did a very good job. The rule of law is a principle. I don't think anybody can come up with a perfect definition of it. Principles tend to be aspirational. Where I would push you a bit is that rule of law is only one of the fundamental principles in the American political system. It also has to be balanced against concepts like popular sovereignty and the right of revolution. And that fundamental principle is in tension and at odds with the rule of law. And where I would like to push you is acknowledging and being willing to deal with some of the messiness of American governing principles. From the perspective of your presentation, everything is just really cool in the United States. And we have other countries that are dictatorial and horrible, but everything is really cool in the United States. And that's because I didn't get you, or you weren't really struggling with the intersection of some of the other principles that make some of these questions much more difficult. When we pushed you, however, I thought you did a terrific job. How do you reconcile American federalism and the diversity of laws and principles in the various states with this notion of one national government, one people? Have we ever been one people? Do we want to be one people? Do we have to be one people in order for the rule of law to really triumph and apply? We didn't get to talk about rule of law as it applies to individuals as much as to public officials. And we really didn't get at all into Locke's concept of the prerogative power and its function in the context of rule of law, or whether the exercise of judicial review is itself a challenge to the rule of law, because the judges declare what the law is. And in that respect, they're kind of above it. So there are places where I wish our conversation could have kept going, but the conversation we had was just terrific. And I thank you so much.
And I just want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues. You guys were wonderful, just as you were yesterday. I really enjoyed, especially the emphasis on civil discourse, which I think is extremely important when we talk about things these days, freedom of speech, which is under assault in our country. I do have to slightly disagree with my esteemed colleague, Judge Leeson, because I argue that I don't think you guys at all are saying everything is cool in the United States at all. You're saying we have this foundation that is very strong, and this is what you've been studying and very important. And it is, I would argue, there is something wonderful about it. And this is part of why we have this program to educate and remind one another and discuss these issues. And so we don't become a Russia, we don't become hungry. And so that's one thing I would say, but overall, just very well done. Grace under pressure. Your logic is wonderful, and I love hearing about your favorite philosophers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time.